Midnight Narratives, Audiobooks brings you Star of the Void, Book 4, The Silent Armada, by D.R.Varyn. Chapter 3. Below Recognition. The oldest systems do not ask who you are. They ask what your movement assumes it may do to everything smaller than itself. That was the lesson Illyros kept tightening around us as the black tempest moved off the outer hold line and into the surviving seam Arlo had marked under the nexus. The route did not brighten to welcome us. It did not open with ceremony or the false generosity of machines built for comfort. It merely continued not killing us, which in that layer of space qualified as encouragement. I stood at the command rail and watched the seam hold on the central glass, while the rest of Illyros remained spread across the canopy in black spans and dead arcs too large for the body to accept honestly. Around us the junction web drifted in silence. Ahead of us, one surviving branch reached inward through geometry that only stabilized when Arlo weighted the tempest as damaged reserve transit and suppressed every ordinary human instinct for identification. No header challenge, no route claim, no neat declaration of rank or intention. Below recognition, the road survived. Tamsin sat forward in the helm chair with one hand light on the yoke and the other near the manual vector keys. She had the look she always wore when velocity and insult had entered into a private arrangement with one another. "If this line gets any narrower," she said, "I am invoicing the architects for emotional damage." Briggs stood half over Arlo's shoulder at the central board, reading the route branches with the expression of a man being personally slandered by mathematics. "They're dead," he said. "Then their estate can pay. The estate built this," he answered, "which means I would still lose the argument." Arlo ignored both of them. He had been doing that for the last hour with admirable consistency. The deeper we moved beneath Illyros, the faster his translation models stopped pretending the old system had any interest in being civil. "I need another half-degree of drift to port," he said. "Not correction. Drift." Tamsin did not look back. "That word remains offensive in this chair. Take it up with the root. The root is a coward. It speaks through you." I watched the seam thin, sharpen, then hold again as she adjusted. Outside the canopy, nothing obvious changed. That had become its own kind of warning. Atheris had taught me that the most dangerous layers of the old network rarely announced themselves with light. They announced themselves through the sudden failure of assumptions that had worked everywhere else in the universe. Nira stood beside the fragment cradle with her head slightly bowed and one hand resting just above the field light. Since we left the outer line, she had gone quieter by degrees. Not withdrawn, more divided perhaps. Part of her remained with us on the bridge. Another part was listening somewhere farther in. "What do you hear?" I asked. Her eyes stayed on the seam. "Less hearing," she said, "more being compared." Briggs let out a low sound in his throat. "Terrific. I hate evaluation even from living people." Naira did not answer him. She rarely did when the truth in her mouth felt heavier than whatever joke was trying to get around it. Arlo pushed a new set of overlays to the main board. Pale branches bloomed around the seam, most of them dying almost instantly as the model shifted. One held. Another flickered once and vanished. A third remained visible only when he stripped every active identity signal from our route profile and weighted the Tempest as a vessel that had already belonged to a larger military movement before that movement was damaged somewhere farther upchain. "It still doesn't behave like destination logic," he said. "It behaves like relation under pressure. If I tell the model we're ordinary travelers, the branch disappears. If I tell it we're command traffic, it starts generating refusal geometries. If I tell it we're reserve movement surviving a wounded line. It lets us continue," I said. "For now." That mattered. Everything useful beyond Atheris had already taught me that permission in these systems was not the same thing as trust. Men raised inside empires confuse the two because institutions do. Show enough force, enough law, enough stamped authority, and the frightened start behaving as though obedience and welcome share a border. Tyrillon Minor had burned under that mistake. Aldara had starved under the slower version. Now Illyros was placing the same question into architecture older than mankind's first expansion war. What sort of movement deserves survival? I did not enjoy how quickly the answer reached inward. At Tirelon, the Empire had ordered me to move Death downward through the correct coordinates and had called that duty. At Aldara, the same machine had rewritten convoy lanes, grain rights and medical passage until hunger itself became a military language. Here, beneath Eliros, the old network appeared to understand something the Empire never would. Command is not only what a ship can force open. It is what the ship presumes everything else must surrender to make its motion possible. "Kael," Arlo said. I looked down. He had shifted to the long-range passive board. 3 relay ghosts still held beyond the outer seams, but they were no longer alone. New returns had bloomed around them in disciplined depth, too faint for casual traffic and too organized for scavengers. "Show me." He expanded the plot. The pattern that emerged was exactly the one I had expected and still hated seeing. Not brute pursuit. Not a destroyer wedge driving straight at the mystery with banners and appetite. Layered survey spacing, ghosted relay spines, probe shelter positions held outside direct berth judgment, and farther out on conventional lanes where ordinary geometry still behaved itself, a screen of slower signatures moving in staggered discipline toward Iliros, with the careful arrogance of people who intended to study first and seize later. Tamsin saw it a beat after I did, and swore softly. "That's not a smash entry." "No," I said. "It isn't." Briggs leaned closer to the board. "Science hulls," he said. "Survey carriers, support craft, and there—" he pointed with one metal finger at a cluster moving in the lee of a larger masked return. "Marine contingencies? Not many, but enough." Arlo was already stripping signal residue away from the outermost approach cluster. "They're not broadcasting much, but the discipline is clear. Somebody organized this after the probes died." "Rourke," Tamsin said. "Or someone smart enough to remain employed by him," I answered. I thought of a theorist then, of the dead shell of Commander Elia Voss at the threshold of the destroyers waiting outside the wound, while Arlo laid 3 options across the board, and I chose the one least likely to let the Empire remain morally untroubled while it learned at our expense. Hide, fight, or wake more of the structure. 3 bad choices, and beneath them the more important recognition. If Rourke lost at Atheris, he would not come back angrier. He would come back disciplined. Not just with ships, I had said then. With scholars, survey corps, sealed archives, better translated headers, and the full appetite of an empire that has smelled a road it does not control. Iliros proved I had not been pessimistic enough. "Any names?" I asked. Arlo built a correlation ladder from the weak relay bleed. Most of it came back scrambled under Fleet Reserve authority. One line survived long enough to attach itself to a bureau identifier. Imperial Deep Survey Bureau. Another returned as logistics abstraction, comparative geometry tasking. A third, half-broken and heavily masked, carried the sort of partitioned clearance usually reserved for men whose rank needed less advertisement than their authority. Briggs read it and gave me a joyless glance. "That smells like Rourke." "It does." Naira lifted her head slightly. "He is not leading with himself," she said. "No," I answered. "He learned." That was the problem with competent enemies. They force memory to become a weapon. A brute can be predicted. A clever man can be slowed. A disciplined one takes instruction from loss and returns with the part of himself most worth fearing intact. Arlo cycled another layer over the outer approach. "They've widened their perimeter rather than pushing the seam again. Look." He traced the pattern with 2 fingers. "They're seeding blind sensor buoys outside direct judgment, building comparative geometry from neighboring vectors. They want Oronox, Echelon, and every secondary implication they can collect without teaching Iliros the wrong lesson too fast." Briggs exhaled once. That would almost be admirable if it belonged to anyone else. Tamsin's hands remained easy on the helm, but I had watched her long enough to know when ease became a sheath. "So what is the answer?" she asked. "Hold here and let them learn around us. Run deeper and hope the route appreciates initiative. Or take a shot at one of those relay spines before their scholar friends finished turning mystery into paperwork." All of them were possible. None of them were clean. That, too, felt familiar. Command problems arrive wearing different uniforms and still ask the same question underneath. Which cost do you plan to carry yourself, and which do you intend to make other people pay so your conscience can remain technically tidy? If we held, Rourke's people would keep learning. Not quickly enough to own Eliros yet, but quickly enough to turn caution into a usable archive. If we struck first, we might preserve our lead at the cost of teaching the Nexus that even our restraint had been temporary. If we ran deeper, we might hold initiative while moving below the layer where ordinary Imperial interpretation could follow cleanly. But deeper also meant older judgment. And older judgment, in my experience, rarely cares whether the men presenting themselves as reasonable feel they have good intentions. I looked at Naira. She was already staring beyond the board into the seam, as if listening to something large enough that my question had not yet caught up with it. "Do we move?" I asked. "Yes." No hesitation. That tightened the bridge by a fraction. "Why?" "Because the outer line is becoming language," she said. Arlo looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means they are teaching relation by repetition. If they remain there, the wrong pattern will become easier to say." Briggs rubbed once at the side of his jaw. "I would like, just once, for her answers to involve nouns that can be welded." "They do," Tamsin said. "You're just not the target audience." I stepped down from the rail and moved beside Naira at the glass. "Show me." She raised one hand and pointed not at the seam itself, but at a slightly darker band running beneath it. I had taken it for absence at first. Old damage, dead geometry, the kind of scar every large machine acquires after enough years and enough impacts. Then Arlo, seeing where she aimed, overlaid the latest route map against it. The darker band held, not brightening, not inviting, persisting. "There's a signature under the admissible line," he said quietly. "A surviving transit scar, not current traffic, older, maybe much older." Briggs leaned in. "Human?" Arlo shook his head. "No, or not in any way that matters. The weight pattern is wrong. It isn't a ship ID. It's more like preserved relation, a class memory." Naira lowered her hand. "It passed when the line was already hurt," she said. "The junction still remembers how it was allowed to continue." Tamsin gave a soft, disbelieving laugh. "So our best path is to imitate an old wound convincingly enough that a dead war system mistakes us for history." Briggs grunted. "Yes, that does sound like us." For a moment I said nothing. The idea offended every surviving Imperial habit in me. Ships identify themselves, commands assert, movement under uncertainty becomes easier, not harder, when hierarchy is clear and machines know which voice outranks which. That is how fleets think. That is also how massacres get formatted cleanly enough to look lawful from orbit. The older the network beneath Eliros became in my understanding, the less I believed it cared about the voice speaking most loudly. It cared about what the movement around that voice did to the line as a whole. Did it preserve relation? Did it widen harm? Did it insist on its own precedence at the expense of every other path trying to survive nearby? Power can compel recognition, I thought. It cannot compel welcome. Atheris had taught that to Rourke the hard way. Eliros seemed prepared to repeat the lesson at scale. "Can we carry the deeper scar?" I asked. Arlo hesitated. "Maybe, but only if we stop behaving like a single ship." Tamsin turned in the helm chair. "Explain that carefully." He pushed a fresh model to the central board. The preserved relation scar beneath the seam did not wait as a lone vessel. It waited as distributed transit under mutual damage and shared discipline. Several movement nodes. Partial coherence. No dominant command spike anywhere in the pattern. If we keep presenting the Tempest as one strong point moving through judgment, the route keeps trying to classify us as an active decision center, Arlo said. If we flatten our profile, helm, engineering, fragment response, signal management, into a cooperative band instead of a command spear, the deeper scar holds longer. Briggs stared at him. "You want me to fly the engine signature like diplomacy." "I want you to stop flying it like ownership." He did not like that, which was one reason I trusted him. Men who enjoy surrendering control too quickly usually find ugly reasons to repeat the experience for other people. "How long would we have to sustain it?" I asked. Arlo ran the numbers once, hated them, ran them again. 27 minutes to reach the lower branch below direct outer observation. Maybe 30 if the seam shifts. Less if Naira is better than the models. Naira did not look offended by being compared to imperfect machinery. She had stopped needing the models to respect her before the rest of us had accepted that they were not the highest available authority in a room. "It will shift," she said, "but not against the same thing all the way through." That was annoyingly useful. Tamsin rolled her shoulders once and put both hands on the yoke. "Fine," she said. "Tell me how to disappear without acting like we're hiding." Briggs straightened from the board with a grimace that meant he had already decided to cooperate and intended to resent the decision theatrically. "I can flatten the drive signature and break the output into offset responses across the ventral and aft grids. It will feel wrong." "Everything since Nixara has felt wrong," Tamsin said. "That is not the encouragement you think it is." Arlo looked at me. "We'll also need to suppress every active hierarchy queue in the ship. Tactical priority spikes, command routing, even some of the internal decision latency. The system is reading how movement is organized, not just where it goes." That reached deeper than engineering, deeper than navigation. Below recognition, Illyros cared about whether command existed as seizure or mutual discipline. It had begun with me saying no to a massacre formatted as duty. Aldara had taken the slower administrative version of the same crime and spread it across grain lines, convoy rights, and frightened colonies until language itself started carrying rifles behind it. If Illyros was going to mean anything more than bigger ruins and older machines, then the old machines had to test the same question at a scale we could not simply shoot our way through. What does refusal become after it survives long enough to organize itself? Not sentiment, doctrine. "Do it," I said. The bridge changed immediately. Briggs dropped into engineering override and began bleeding the primary drive output into layered compensations that made the deck hum unevenly beneath my boots. Tamsin recalibrated manual control thresholds until the helm no longer answered like a hunter and started answering like something wounded but disciplined enough to keep moving anyway. Arlo flattened route priority across the Tempest's decision architecture, suppressing command spikes wherever the internal systems tried to privilege a single will too cleanly. Even the lights changed, not brightness, emphasis. The ship stopped feeling like a spear aimed through mystery and started feeling like several hard-won functions agreeing not to die in the same direction at the same time. Naira remained by the fragment, one hand above the glow. "Lower the weapons further," she said. Briggs looked up from engineering. "They're cold." "Lower them." He frowned, then obeyed. Somewhere deep in the Tempest, the last active readiness in the forward banks eased down another fraction. The seam ahead sharpened. Arlo made a startled sound. "That helped." Tamsin smiled thinly. "The giant dead war road disapproves of posture. Noted." We moved. The black Tempest entered the deeper branch without thrusting into it. Tamsin let the ship settle into the surviving scar beneath Illyros, while Briggs fed power just strongly enough to remain part of the movement and not strongly enough to look like we believed we owned it. The outer nexus fell away by degrees. Around us, black geometry thickened into layers ordinary vision refused to rank correctly. A span above the canopy became a corridor for half a second, and then denied having ever offered the courtesy. Far off to starboard, a buried seam opened long enough to show white internal lines beneath a dead surface, then closed before Arlo's board finished naming what it had seen. No one spoke much. There are passages where language only serves to remind the body that it is frightened. I kept my hands on the command rail and watched the old system compare us against itself. At one point the deeper branch narrowed so sharply I thought the route had decided against us after all. A white lattice formed ahead, thin as frost and twice as unforgiving. Tamsin did not pull away. Briggs did not spike power. Arlo did not try to reclassify our position under some brighter, louder human category. Naira said, very quietly, "Not through, with." Tamsin let the Tempest slip half a degree port and reduce output at the same time. The lattice passed beside us instead of across us. A few seconds later the branch opened again. Briggs exhaled in one slow, offended stream. "I would like that recorded somewhere under the category of intolerable." "It is," Arlo said. "Underlived experience." The lower line held. Behind us, the outer observation layer of Illyros dimmed by increments until even the Imperial relay ghosts became conjecture. Ahead of us, something older began to assemble itself out of black proportion and wounded distance. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough. A line of void deeper than the surrounding dark. A registration mouth, perhaps, or the beginning of one. Echelon, I thought. Not reached. Named more honestly now. At the same time, Arlo caught new traffic on the outer relay bleed. The range was terrible, the signal worse. But a few phrases survived the root noise long enough to matter. Comparative geometry from Oronox. Translation layer instability. Marine contingencies hold. And one name buried under partitioned authority and signal discipline, but clear enough for me to hear the cost of it. Ma. Theon Ma had come to Illyros after all. That mattered more than a dozen destroyers. Scholars do not win wars on their own, but they teach men like Rourke which questions are worth asking before the soldiers go in to die answering them incorrectly. Tamsin, I said, how much farther until we drop beneath even their indirect line? She checked the board and did not like what it told her. 7 minutes if the branch remains honest. 11 if it starts acting like architecture. So 7 then, Briggs muttered. Arlo was still listening to the damaged relay bleed. They're widening the net, no push to the seam yet. Just smarter perimeter work. Mar is slowing him down. Good, I said. Tamsin glanced back. You sound disappointed by how useful that is. I prefer enemies who make mistakes faster. That seems healthy. It was learned, not inherited. Nira lifted her head sharply. Quiet. Everyone obeyed. Not because she raised her voice, because she never did unless the truth arriving behind it had already become urgent enough that disobedience would qualify as volunteer work for catastrophe. The lower branch ahead had changed, not closed, tilting. The darkness around the emerging registration mouth thickened into layered depth. Somewhere inside it I felt, not heard, not saw, but felt, the beginning of a comparison large enough to make the bridge air itself seem provisional. Naira's hand hovered over the fragment. It knows we are here, she said. No one answered immediately. Some statements are too large to improve by repetition. Tamsin's voice, when it came, was nearly gentle. The lower branch? Naira shook her head. Not the branch. That gave the moment its weight. Behind us, Rourke's smarter pursuit widened through conventional space with scholars, survey corps, and marines disciplined enough to wait until waiting had taught them something worth weaponizing. Ahead of us, beneath Illyros, the deeper chain toward Echelon had finally begun to notice the shape we were choosing not to force upon it. Not welcome. Recognition. Below recognition, we had survived. Now something older was deciding whether survival justified continuation. I tightened my grip once on the rail and looked through the dark toward the registration mouth assembling itself ahead of us. Hold the line, I said. No one on my bridge mistook that for a simple navigational instruction. Tamsin kept the Tempest steady. Briggs held the drives in their wounded discipline. Arlo preserved the flattened relation architecture across the ship's systems. Naira listened with the fragment brightening softly beside her, as if some buried part of the road remembered having already judged us once and had not yet decided whether that first mercy remained binding. Outside the canopy, the lower branch bent inward toward a darkness that no longer resembled distance. It resembled procedure. It resembled command. It resembled a gate that had not yet agreed to call itself one. And behind us, somewhere beyond the outer seams of Illyros, Admiral Cassian Rourke had done exactly what I had warned the Empire would do after Atheris. He had come smarter, not heavier, which meant whatever happened next at Echelon would no longer be a contest of arrival alone. It would be a contest of interpretation. The old network had begun weighing the difference. So had I. Chapter 4. Echelon Gate. Some gates are built to keep enemies out. Better gates are built to decide what kind of war you are allowed to bring through them. That was the thought waiting for me when Echelon began to assemble itself out of the dark. The lower branch beneath Illyros did not end in a ring. It did not flare into some noble threshold fit for old legends and newer lies. It narrowed instead into layered black geometry that felt less like a rival than procedure. Distances thickened. Surfaces that had looked like dead architecture admitted hidden depth. The darkness ahead ceased resembling open space and took on the clean emotional weight of an office where every wrong answer has already been priced. I stood at the command rail and watched the registration mouth grow clearer by degrees. Not large. Scale had become too small a word for this part of the old network. The structure ahead hung in staggered planes, a central aperture broad enough to swallow carriers, flanking spines buried in deeper shadow, and above them all a crown of intersecting bands so thin and pale they looked at first like frost caught in vacuum. Then the tactical glass translated one section of their relation, and I understood I was not looking at ornament. I was looking at sorting logic made visible. Tamsin sat forward in the helm chair, both hands now on the yoke, which told me more than any warning tone would have. "Well," she said, "that is offensively administrative." Arlo laughed once under his breath, not because it was funny, because fear in him sometimes needed to disguise itself as appreciation before it could remain useful. "You see it too?" "I see a thing that looks exactly like a customs officer if customs officers were large enough to ruin civilizations." Briggs kept one hand on the engineering override, and the other braced against the board. Drive output spread across his display in wounded compensations and flattened response bands. "I've worked around enough government hardware to confirm the resemblance," he said. "This one simply has better budget." Naira stood beside the fragment cradle with the same divided stillness she had carried since we entered the lower branch. The blue field light touched her face and made her look less illuminated than translated. "It is not deciding entry," she said. No one answered immediately. That had become a habit with Naira, and a wise one. Her first statement is rarely the one ordinary minds want. It is usually the one they need several seconds to survive. "What is it deciding?" I asked. Her gaze remained on the registration mouth. "Relation after entry," she said. "What passage becomes once it is admitted deeper." Arlo made a small, pained sound of triumph. "That fits." "Of course it does," Briggs muttered, "because I have once again chosen a life where the worst possible answer keeps being correct." I looked through the forward glass as the black tempest continued inward under the cooperative profile we had built to satisfy the preserved scar beneath Illyros. We no longer moved like a spear. We moved like several disciplined injuries refusing to separate. The deck hummed wrong beneath my boots because Briggs had flattened the drive output into shared compensations. Internal routing across the ship pulsed with Arlo's suppression of hierarchy spikes. Tamsin flew as though she were escorting the motion rather than commanding it. Below recognition, the system had tolerated us. Now something deeper wanted to know what that tolerance served. The registration mouth widened just enough to reveal structure behind structure. A second aperture lay within the first, rotated off axis from any geometry human engineers would have called friendly. Beyond that sat a field of dark alignments recessed so deep into the surrounding architecture they barely existed until the fragment brightened and forced them into legibility. Births, I thought. Not guessed. Recognized. The old unease from Illyros returned at once, only harder now because the implication was no longer abstract. The route chain beyond Etheris did not merely pass near hidden fleet reserve. It processed movement through it. "Arlo," I said, "show me everything the system is willing to call this." He was already trying. The tactical overlays thickened. Most translation layers died the moment they touched the registration mouth. A few survived. Partial values surfaced along the pale bands above the aperture, and then separated into strings too organized to be noise and too damaged to become honest language. Passage correlation command weight fleet relation, the last phrase held longest. Tamsin read it aloud in a tone usually reserved for bad weather and worse people. "Fleet relation." Briggs leaned closer. "That is not a civilian phrase." "No," I said, "it isn't." The aperture ahead changed while we watched. The innermost dark took on contour. Black planes withdrew from one another with no visible mechanism, revealing a corridor so broad the tempest should have looked microscopic against it. Instead, the scale only made the thing feel intimate in the wrong way. A giant machine does not need to rush when it is certain the smaller object already exists inside its jurisdiction. "Speed?" Tamsin asked. Arlo checked the lower branch and hated what it told him. "Reduce by 6. Not enough to look frightened. Enough to suggest we understand we're passing through somebody else's sentence. That is the most irritating flight instruction I have received this month," she said. "And yet," Briggs replied, "you know exactly what he means." She did, which was one reason I had trusted her with impossible routes ever since Nixara tried to kill us with beauty and debris. The tempest eased down. The registration bands above the aperture sharpened in answer. Arlo stopped breathing for a moment, then started again. "It's reading the change." "Approval?" Briggs asked. "Not exactly." "Useful?" "No," Arlo said, "but interesting." It was always dangerous when Arlo sounded pleased at the same time he sounded alarmed. "What did it do?" I asked. He pushed the next layer to the main display. A series of pale nodes had come alive inside the corridor ahead, not in a straight line, but in staggered relation across the width of the passage. They did not mark safe transit. They marked tolerable shape. Our current profile mapped between them imperfectly, as though the system were comparing our cooperative movement against some older distributed pattern it only half accepted. Nira's hand lifted an inch above the fragment. It is asking whether we remain what we claimed by surviving. The words settled over the bridge with more force than volume. At Tiralon Minor, the Empire had demanded obedience to a command chain that treated murder as proper movement through authority. At Aldara, it had broken worlds more slowly by rewriting supply into control and calling hunger a security doctrine. In both cases, the structure above the action assumed the same thing. That command, once asserted, had the right to turn everything smaller into function. Echelon, I was beginning to understand, had no patience for that assumption. It was not asking whether we could force passage. It was asking what our passage intended to make of the line beyond it. Can it see intent that clearly? Tamsin asked. Nira did not answer right away. That depends how much intent has already become habit, she said. Briggs let out a low sound. I preferred the part where old alien systems only wanted to tear ships apart. You were lying, Tamsin said. I was coping. We entered the outer reach of the aperture. No alarm sounded. No violence struck. The registration bands simply moved. White lattice descended in slow planes around the corridor mouth, not closing it, only dividing it into relational depths. A channel that had looked central became secondary. A seam to port brightened and then died. Another opened below us with quiet finality. Arlo's hands danced across his board. It's classifying the route in real time. By what? I asked. Not destination, not mass, something uglier. He swallowed. It's sorting by what else each movement would wake if allowed farther in. That was the moment the chapter truly announced itself. Until then I had still been half willing to treat Echelon as a gate with unusual manners. The old lie. The comfortable one. Call the mystery transportation, and you get to postpone admitting it was built for war. But the corridors on Arlo's display no longer resembled roads at all. They resembled response trees. Permit this class of movement and those berths remain dormant. Permit that claim and those defense lines wake in support or denial. Let command enter under one profile and the system allocates reserve relation elsewhere to preserve the line. The whole structure behaved as if passage permissions, fleet categories, and kill solutions were one integrated question. The roads were not roads. They were mobilization logic. The phrase from Tiralon came back to me with enough force that I nearly hated it for surviving. The network did not feel like trade. It felt like a lock. Nira turned her head slightly as if hearing the same memory move through me and choosing not to say so aloud. What is it? Tamsin asked. I realized everyone was looking at me, not because I was captain. Because command, for better or worse, also means being the first person required to say the shape of the thing once it becomes visible enough to frighten everybody else. Echelon isn't a crossing, I said. It's a choke point. Briggs's mouth tightened. Yes. Part gate, yes. I looked at the registration bands again, then at the dark recesses beyond them, where the first berth lines waited half-hidden in the structure like unsheathed consequences. Part registrar, I said. Arlo nodded at once. And part fleet lock. That phrase held the bridge. No one corrected it. No one could, because once said aloud, it explained too much too quickly not to be true. The aperture ahead opened another degree. Within the deeper recesses beyond it, black hull lines appeared and vanished according to the registration pulses crossing our path. Some were small enough to be escorts or fast pickets. Others stretched farther than destroyers and retained their geometry with the kind of insulting discipline that only purpose can preserve after ages. Not wrecks, then. Not memorial hulls. Waiting ships. Dormant because the line had not yet required them to remember themselves. Tamsin's voice came back first, flatter than before. How many? Arlo tried not to answer. That usually meant the answer was offensive. Not enough. Briggs shot him a look. That is not a number. It's worse than a number. It's a category problem. I can see 7 for certain. Maybe 12. Maybe more behind the deeper lattice. Some of these void returns aren't empty. They're withheld. I watched the hidden hulls through the aperture while the Tempest held its disciplined wound profile together. The Empire builds fleets the way accountants build arguments. Mass, sequence, redundancy, and the confidence that anything not already under the ledger will be by the time the quarter closes. Even its warships carry administrative assumptions in their bones. They exist to project order outward until resistance begins looking like paperwork overdue. The silent hulls at Echelon carried none of that emotional filth. They looked like one thing only: a line meant to hold, not to conquer, to hold. That difference mattered enough that I felt it before I could justify it. Naira spoke softly, almost to herself. They were not waiting for traffic. No, I said. They were waiting for pressure. That fit too well. Arlo was busy passing the next layer of translated values. His face had gone pale in the display light again, not from fear now, but from the dangerous edge where wonder starts learning it may have military implications. Kael. I moved beside his board. The registration logic had opened a deeper scroll beneath the active corridor. The words were broken, but their relation came through clearly enough to offend me. Admission path provisional command claim deferred escort reserve sealed convergence authority withheld Briggs read over my shoulder and swore with admirable craftsmanship. That, he said, is the sort of sentence written by people who put guns behind grammar. Yes, I said. That was the part I understood most cleanly. Tirelon had hidden massacre in procedure. Aldara had hidden theft in ration policy. Echelon, at least, was honest enough to admit it had joined command language to force from the beginning. The old system was not kinder than Empire, only less hypocritical. Command claim deferred, Tamsin said. Meaning what? Meaning it sees us, Arlo said, but it isn't letting a single authority posture define the passage. Naira's eyes remained on the corridor. It will not let one will stand in for the whole movement. There was the moral question again, larger now, older, stripped of flags. What becomes of command when the structure judging it refuses to confuse dominance with fitness? I had spent years learning variations of the same answer in bloodier places. At Havoc's shroud, pride held where law had no right to ask. At Atheris, restraint earned the only passage that mattered. At Aldara, refusal had ceased being private conscience and become something contagious enough to frighten administrators. Now Echelon was asking whether that refusal could survive organization without becoming a cleaner species of tyranny. I did not know yet, but I knew the Empire's answer, and I hated it on sight. A new burst of outer-band traffic bled through the damaged relay noise behind us. Arlo caught it first. They're trying something. Where? I asked. Not here. Outer comparative line. One of the survey buoys just pushed a stronger relation stack toward the seam. Briggs looked up sharply. A probe? No. Smarter. They're not entering. They're feeding the geometry a cleaner model of Imperial formation discipline. Tamsin laughed once without humor. Of course they are. The registration bands above our corridor shifted, not against us, away, as if the deeper structure had glanced toward the new assertion from outside and filed it under a category already familiar enough to disdain. Naira's hand tightened slightly over the fragment. It does not like being told what the line means. That makes two of us, Briggs said. Arlo scrubbed through the changing values and went still. It's redirecting reserve weight. To us? I asked. No, around us, that's the point. He expanded the branch map. The deeper corridor ahead remained open, but 3 adjacent lines had gone dark, while a 4th brightened beneath the visible berth layer. Not random. Not damage. Priority adjustment. The fleet lock was not merely reading our passage. It was reallocating dormant potential in response to conflicting claims about what passage should be. I felt the scale of it then. Not just hidden ships. Doctrine. A gate linked to berth logic. Berths linked to permissions. Permissions linked to which classes of coordinated force the line would preserve, deny, or hold in reserve, while something worse happened elsewhere. The whole system had been built by minds that treated traffic, command, and battle posture as one problem. No wonder the old roads felt less like roads the deeper we went. They were made by a civilization that expected war to arrive through every corridor worth defending. Tamsin, I said, can you keep us inside the provisional path if the next shift comes harder? She looked at the board, then at the moving bands ahead, then out through the canopy where the dark hulls within the berth recesses kept their patient silence like officers who no longer needed introductions. Yes, she said. That was all. I did not ask how. When Tamsin answers that quickly, the better use of a captain's time is getting everyone else worthy of her confidence. Briggs. Already bleeding more weight into the ventral grid. If the corridor kicks sideways, I can make the Tempest look less certain about itself. Arlo. I'm tracking the reserve reallocations. If the Imperial model outside causes another redirect, I'll have maybe 2 seconds before the corridor starts translating that into local consequence. Nearer. She did not turn. It wants the truth of the ship, she said. Briggs stared at the back of her head. I need that to become more practical very soon. It is practical, she said. Do not let the Tempest lie about what it is. That tightened something in the room for reasons not entirely tied to survival. The Black Tempest had been lying about what she was ever since I stole her out of Nixara under prototype markings and desperate luck. The Empire lied about her on paper. I lied to myself about her when the alternative required admitting I had stolen not merely a ship, but a question older powers had already spent effort concealing. Briggs had found too many hidden compatibilities. Atheris had recognized too much too quickly. Illyros had weighted her relation as though some part of her class belonged farther inside the old system than any Imperial cruiser had a right to stand. Now Naira was telling us the passage ahead would narrow if the ship kept pretending to be simpler than she was. I did not like how true that sounded. No time to improve on it, though. The outer assertion from Rourke's people sharpened again. The registration bands answered by dropping a white lattice straight across the upper corridor to starboard. A second band formed below us, this one pale and thin as a held blade. "Shift coming," Arlo snapped. "I see it," Tamsin said. The Tempest moved. Not hard. Hard would have looked like insistence. She let the ship settle 1/2 degree down and 2 degrees left, while Briggs thinned the drive response into injured cooperation, and Arlo suppressed a sudden tactical spike before the internal systems could present it as command emphasis. The white band below us passed so close beneath the hull that every display on the bridge stuttered once in offended sympathy. Something deep in the ship rang. Not metal. Relation. For one terrible heartbeat, the hidden hulls inside the berth recesses brightened under the registration lattice. Not their engines, not wake lights. Recognition bands running along impossible flanks and buried spines, pale as winter thought. I saw one long bow uncurl by a measure too small to be called motion and too deliberate to be an illusion. Then the band passed. The brightness died. The hull returned to dormancy, but the bridge had already gone still. Briggs spoke first, because he has always understood that when terror finally becomes precise, profanity is a form of professionalism. That, he said carefully, was a warship. "Yes," I said. Arlo's eyes remained fixed on the dead dark berth, and it almost answered the path shift. Not answered us. Answered the path. That distinction mattered enough that I felt it like cold through the sternum. The ships hidden in Echelon were not sleeping under simple orders. They were integrated into the gate's judgments. Movement through the choke point could wake them, deny them, reassign them or hold them in reserve according to the larger relation the system was preserving. Fleet categories, command claims, passage permissions, one military problem. Echelon had made the truth plain. The line did not separate transit from war. It had been built by people who knew better. "Kael," Naira said. I looked at her. She had finally turned away from the registration mouth and now faced the deeper dark beyond the first berth layer. The fragment's light moved across her skin in faint branching traces, not enough to frighten me anymore because I had moved beyond choosing only one category for my fear. "What? This is only the lock." That sentence landed harder than the sight of the waking hull. Tamsin's hands stayed on the yoke. "I am going to need you to explain that with great tenderness." Naira raised one hand and pointed through the aperture, beyond the visible recesses, toward a darker vector buried beneath the first reserve grid. Arlo overlaid the route map at once. The hidden line he found under her gesture did not align with our current corridor. It angled away through fractured geometry and deeper berth shadows toward a region the translation web had barely touched. A surviving designation surfaced there in broken relation. Orinox, the word, did not appear alone. It hung beside a cluster of values Arlo had to force into partial human sense. Birth chain reserve, dormancy, deeper hold. Briggs read them and looked unhappy in a way I had learned to treat as useful. "So Echelon sorts the line," he said. "Orinox keeps the waiting answer." "Yes," Naira said. Tamsin let out a long breath through her teeth. "Good. Excellent. I assume the route to that charming place is impossible, insulting, and built by murder-minded mathematicians." Arlo checked the emerging branch and actually smiled in despair. All three, wonderful. The registration mouth behind us began to close by increments. Not on our hull. Behind our passage. The provisional corridor ahead remained open, but only one line now held deeper into the structure, and it aimed straight toward the fractured reserve Vectornera had named. Behind us, Rourke's scholars were still widening their careful perimeter in conventional space, teaching the outer seams by repetition and caution. Ahead of us lay the first true graveyard of waiting force hidden inside the old doctrine. The Empire had come smarter. The network had answered by showing us just enough to understand how badly intelligence alone could still lose. I watched the surviving line to Orinox brighten under the registration logic and felt the future narrow into its next hard shape. At Tiralon, I had learned that obedience without conscience is simply cleanly managed atrocity. At Oldara, I had learned that rebellion becomes real the moment civilians stop believing procedure deserves the benefit of the doubt. At Echelon, I had learned something worse than either truth and larger than both. There are systems so old and so disciplined, they do not merely defend territory. They defend categories of movement, and if you approach them wrongly, they do not kill you because you are an enemy. They kill you because the line cannot survive what your command would make of it if admitted farther. "Tamsin," I said. She did not look back. "Yes, Captain. Tag the Orinox branch. Already have. Can you take us there?" She checked the impossible line once, twice, then smiled the dangerous smile she reserved for roots with poor manners and older teeth. "Yes," she said, "but I expect to hate every second of it. That means the day still resembles us." Briggs groaned softly. "Your optimism remains suspicious." "Not optimism," I said. I looked once more at the dark recesses of Echelon, where the first silent warships waited behind the gate's judgments, like reserve verdicts not yet made public. Recognition. And with Echelon narrowing behind us and Orinox beginning to open ahead, the Black Tempest moved deeper into the part of the old war road, where waiting fleets had learned to sleep with one eye open. Subscribe now, and turn on notifications, so you do not miss the next release, future chapters, and every new journey into the Void Corsair Saga. The gates are waking. The Empire is coming, and the Black Tempest is not done running yet.